And welcome to Secular Sexuality, the ACA show with by far the bravest call screeners. I'm Christy Powell. My newest official co-host tonight is someone who knows a thing or two about recovering from religious trauma. Welcome, Nate Smith.
Official co-host?
Yeah, we decided to make that official while the music was running. Congratulations.
Wow, this is just proof, folks, that if you send Christy enough offensive memes on Facebook, he will crack and make you a co-host on his show. Just say it.
That's the strategy. That works for everybody. Call the show, send in memes, join the Facebook group. There are a lot of great ways to interact. But in the meantime, our guest tonight is a counselor and religious recovery consultant here to speak about the upcoming conference on religious trauma. Welcome, Janice Selbie.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me on your amazing program. I'm happy to be here.
So glad to have you.
Thanks, Janice. So tonight we're going to be divorcing religion and kicking it to a studio apartment to eat cold chili straight from the can. So give us a call. The number is 512-991-9242, or you can also reach us at nearly the speed of light at tiny.cc/callsex, because the show is starting right now, folks. Let's talk.
All right. Janice, I would love to just hear a little bit more about what it is you do. You know, I myself was recently interviewed as a therapist specializing in religious trauma. And honestly, I found myself kind of struggling to explain what that work actually looks like. So I'd love to start by just hearing how you define religious trauma.
Sure. I feel like there's a couple of different aspects to it. So someone can be traumatized by another person's behavior under the guise of religion. So we tend to think of that horrible thing when we think of priests molesting children, right? But religious trauma syndrome is different, because that is really more of a collection of symptoms that we experience when we're part of a fundamentalist group, and then that we experience when we leave that fundamentalist group, because there are losses in both scenarios, and it really is a double whammy when you leave, because then you're also losing your community, losing your identity. I lost my marriage, as a number of people do. So that's kind of how I break down religious trauma versus religious trauma syndrome.
Sure. Well, then how does religious trauma syndrome fit the bill for complex PTSD from like a more therapist perspective?
Right. So complex PTSD is generally when it has been ongoing for a long time. It's not a one-time incident. So I was raised in a fundamentalist household. So from the time I was born and, all through my growing up, it was hammered into me that the Bible was the true, literal, inerrant word of God, and that everything in that Bible was still true for today. So that they're, growing up as a child, believing in a literal hell, believing that an innocent man had to be tortured to death because I was so vile, because I, at 5 years old, was such a terrible, terrible human. So when you're going week after week to church and hearing this, and then of course you're probably going to youth group, you're probably in choir, you're probably doing a Bible study. So it really, you're subjected to the content over and over and over again. And not to mention, your own identity doesn't really have the opportunity to develop apart from that. You are told how to be and what to think and how to behave. So it's pretty upsetting.
Yeah. Well, what is it then that makes religious trauma maybe unique in terms of trauma or complex trauma, and maybe especially insidious in some of these ways?
I think largely because, first of all, it's typically not recognized by therapists, or not even recognized by society at large. So we have a lot of grief when we divorce religion, or
Mhm.
when we, when we're leaving that fundamentalist group. There's grief over our losses, but that grief isn't recognized the same way as, if you lose a spouse, or even if your dog dies, a beloved pet dies, people tend to have some sympathy for that and cut you some slack when you're struggling, but not so with religious trauma. I mean, when my entire worldview and my own identity dissolved around me into nothingness, I mean, talk about an existential crisis. But you don't get a day off work for it. You just got to keep going. How are you? I don't even know how I am. I don't even know who I am. So
I just found out I'm going to die and not go to heaven forever. So
yes.
thanks for bringing that up.
That's exactly, I mean, and unless people have lived through it, they really have a very hard time relating to it. And what you hear frequently is, oh, so you stopped believing in Santa Claus, which I'm going to tell you is super offensive. That is so offensive to say to somebody when their entire worldview has come crashing down to the ground. So it's insidious in that way. And also because in North America, religion is pervasive. Like I'm in Canada. I think we don't have it quite as bad here as you guys do in the States, but it's still everywhere. People still kind of use it as a yardstick for measuring things.
You guys don't pledge allegiance to God every single day and put him on your money and all of that? That's not required by God? Okay. All right.
No, we have a queen that's equally as irrelevant, Christy.
Okay. Fair.
And on all our money. Yes.
Yes.
Well,
that was a good point, though. What you said, Janice, that what makes religious trauma especially insidious is that the people that we normally might lean on for help and for support during something like the loss of a spouse or a pet, those are quite often the people that leave us and hang us out to dry when we leave religion.
It's so true. It's so true. Yeah, and to lose your community and then often be shunned by them. And I mean, I think of these women who've grown up in really fundamentalist situations. They have like 6 and 7 kids, right? And they're only in their 20s or something, these women. And when they leave, they really leave, and they don't have the skills needed to get by in the world, to be able to provide for their children. And then, of course, also the religious communities, often I'm thinking of the Orthodox Jewish communities, they band together and they will, have the money to take the mother to court and try and keep the children and not allow her to put them in public school. So the losses are so great. It's exhausting when you divorce religion.
Yeah. No, I hear that. And I'm sure that a lot of these experiences are very familiar to a ton of the people watching right now. But when it comes to being in the therapist office, what are some of the symptoms or maybe the impact of religious trauma?
Well, you touched on it before when you were asking about how, pardon me, how is it like complex PTSD, or how does it, what's the crossover there? So a lot of people who have religious trauma syndrome, they do have nightmares and flashbacks, and there's the hyper arousal, or for some people, they can just feel numb, like that they're not feeling anything. Inaccurate beliefs and self-hatred can be very strong and very hard to overcome as you are, trying to push back against these horrible stories that you've been told from childhood for a lot of us, that if you blaspheme the Holy Spirit, you're going to hell, or whatever the things are that we are having to deal with. And physically, poor sleep, gastrointestinal issues, weight gain and weight loss, tension headaches and migraines. And even when we think of the grief portion, there's anger, there's sadness and confusion. And that can even also show up as clumsiness. When we're grieving, we can be clumsy because we're in a fog. So we're not really, we're not capable of paying as close attention sometimes as we ought to be. So those things can all happen when we have religious trauma syndrome.
Yeah. Well, I know that the loss of community, the loss of family, the pervasiveness of religion in the culture, like all of those things really contribute to this. But I'm curious if you have a read on why religion itself can be so traumatizing for so many people, or maybe what types of like specific beliefs or teachings cause that kind of damage.
For sure, the notion of us versus them, in and out groups. And when we just look through history, we see so many wars that have actually been fought over this very thing. And think of the Crusades, and think of times when the Muslims through history have tried to take over. So people really believing that they are righteous and they have righteous indignation and righteous anger, and God is on their side and the infidels must pay. So that kind of thinking, certainly very damaging. And of course, as I mentioned, the whole concept of indoctrinating children to believe in hell is just, that sticks with people. And the younger we are, when a trustworthy person like our parents or a teacher tells us something scary, right? So we're taking it in, and we're taking it in with fear also, and it's come from a trusted source, and that goes into our brain, and it's like surrounded with barbed wire and psychological booby traps that make it hard even for us to be able to question it. Like the cognitive dissonance is just massive. It really takes a tremendous amount of courage to be willing to examine those core beliefs that we've had for many, many years.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned that growing up for you, you were taught that the Bible is literally true and still relevant. And I know that I have seen that in my own life and in the people that I work with, that idea of like the inerrancy of the scripture. If we're talking specifically about like evangelical Christianity, this idea that this ancient book of poetry somehow overrides our natural instincts and our natural desires for, for justice and compassion and these different things, when there's this ancient book that encourages people to kick out a family member and completely disfellowship them from their community and these different things. That idea that we can like literally deify these ideals over what our instincts, what our intuition is showing us.
Right. So people end up choosing religion over relationship, or they're choosing their ideology because it has become so enmeshed with their identity. It's virtually impossible for them to distinguish between the two, and which is also why deeply religious people can get so offended if you question their beliefs, because they will take it as a personal affront, because it's not just their belief, it's their identity. And I mean, one other teaching that is just really so brutal is this whole concept of obedience. You must obey the first time, every time. So religion would really seek to squash curiosity or autonomy, and instead, your parents just end up insisting, or your teachers end up insisting, you must fit this paradigm. You must be a round peg in a round hole. That's all there is to it. And you can be punished for questioning. And it's seen as, instead of us seeing it as curiosity, it's instead viewed as disobedience. And that just takes such a huge toll. And it prevents us from being authentic. We don't even know who we are when we leave religion. We really don't, because we only know who we are in the context of the religious story that we've been told.
that version of ourselves, that box that we've been trying to fit ourselves into, even though, again, we are overriding our own intuition, like our own relationship with our body, our own belief systems. Each person, I don't mean for this to sound too wooey, but we all have a natural gut reaction as we co-regulate with one another, and as we just witness things that offend us or upset us. That's not to say that like our internal body's conscience or whatever is magic, but it's worth listening to. And when religion tells us to override that or to ignore that, we really violate that relationship.
It's so true. And, I look at my mother, who's quite elderly. And so my dad was like super uptight, fundy, very rigid, authoritarian. And my mom never was. She's always been more about the love and, just kind of more relaxed in her faith. And so when she finds out the work I'm doing and she says, oh, well, but my faith has only ever been wonderful for me. And I'm going, really? Because you stayed married to an abusive son of a bitch for almost 50 years. And me and my siblings, we had to be part of that. We had to grow up in that house and witness that. So you're saying that your faith only helped you, but the teaching that God hates divorce, that definitely harmed you. The teaching that you must always turn the other cheek, bullshit.
That is so true. And that really resonates with me because my mother went from my abusive father to another abusive husband. And she likes to say the same thing. Well, my faith helped me through those times. No, your faith made it worse. Your faith made it worse for everybody in your life. Like there's a reason why I left when I was 14. And, like you were saying earlier with the demand for obedience, right? Like it's amazing how quickly you go from being everybody's favorite devout little Christian and to having some doubts after reading the book and asking honest questions and being completely vilified and ostracized for that. And then especially as a child, it's like, well, you wanted me to read this book and I read this book and it's fucking crazy, man. Like, what is going on here? Like, are you telling me you would take me up a mountain and stab me in the heart if a voice in your head told you to? Like, that's terrifying.
Please don't.
Yeah, please maybe don't. We are still looking for some calls here, folks. So you can come in on the internet at tiny.cc/callsex or 512-991-9242. Give us a call. We want to talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
Christy?
One story. Shall I go?
Go ahead.
So I was raised in fundamentalism and didn't start questioning till my late 30s. Didn't leave until around 40. And I had been married to a man who was a pastor, and I homeschooled my kids and was very, very conservative. So no makeup, no jewelry. My hair was always covered, that sort of thing. And but then I started feeling uncomfortable because I felt like his voice was always going to be worth more in that marriage, just by virtue of the fact that he has a penis. And I did have a problem with that. And then there was a series of tragedies that happened. And then with the last one being our youngest daughter was afflicted with a life-threatening illness. And at that point, I was just like, I have bet on the wrong horse. This can't be right. I mean, I've tried to live a life closer to the Bible and closer to God than anybody else I know. And I'm just getting this shitstorm raining down over me. And that was the tragedy that started to shake me free from my cognitive dissonance so I could actually give myself permission to start looking elsewhere and start looking at other religions. And then I did a deep dive into the whole New Age camp, and I parked there for a few years until I realized that I didn't even need that. I was just fine on my own. Didn't need anybody telling me how to do my life except me.
That's awesome. I heard you on one of the Recovering from Religion segments that you did for us. I heard you say something really profound. You said that doubt is the first step towards knowledge. Do you remember that? And that's kind of what you're saying here, is that those questions are kind of the first things that are going to lead you towards a path that is actually reality, more in line with what's true.
Well, and something that's worth maybe pointing out here, Janice, I don't know what your experience was, but myself, like I heard you talking about how you tried harder than perhaps anybody around you to connect with God. And that was very much my story. Like I was as devout as I possibly knew how to be. I was really committed. And it wasn't until I started working with the atheist community or the ex-evangelical community and these different things that I realized just how many people were experiencing religious trauma without themselves ever having been particularly devout or really committed to these ideas. I led a process group as we were working through some of these issues, and was really shocked to find out that 6 out of 6 people that were in the group had themselves never really truly believed, but it had to kind of pay lip service or go through the motions because of their families, because of their culture, because of maybe even a sense of desperation and a desire to like override that doubt. So we're not just talking here about people that, you know, were dyed in the wool true believers. I mean, that getting away from Santa Claus is a part of it, but there's more to it than that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And whether you were forced into an inauthentic belief system because of, say, a covenant or a vow that you made at 6 years old, because you, at 6 years old, want to please your parents. Your parents keep you alive. So you have a vested interest in wanting to please them. And so when they say, you know, you really need to accept Jesus in your heart, or whether you were a teenager at church camp and there is an emotionally manipulative youth pastor and your peers who are very susceptible to emotional hype and everything too, and they have that altar call at that last night of the church camp, and you're, you know, everyone's saying, go up, you just gotta give your life to Jesus. And so you are under duress, psychological duress, emotional duress, and you don't even have the ability necessarily at that point to think critically about the Bible, about these things that you are being told, and yet you go through with that. You're forced to go through the motions. And I want your listeners to know that it is completely fine, and there's no shame in breaking that contract, that vow, that covenant that you made at some point. I talk about it in terms of a separation agreement, because you are divorcing religion and you don't have to live by those rules anymore.
Yeah, I've said this on the show before, but it wasn't until I started to study hypnosis and learn a little bit about like interpersonal neurobiology and these different aspects of how our brains and how our bodies work and how we co-regulate and how that can be impacted by music and by, you know, standing with your hand up in a very hot room for hours on end. Like that's a pretty manipulative tactic. And it is going to generate an emotional reaction and a quote unquote spiritual experience that really hooked me into all of this.
Yeah, like a form of mystical manipulation. And so we can see also with chanting or speaking in tongues, or you look at the whirling dervishes in Turkey, they can get themselves into an altered state of consciousness by doing those very actions, those things that you're talking about. And so you're in there. And then if you also have this expectation that something supernatural is going to happen, then that is exactly how you're going to interpret anything that does happen, that just happens to be a physiological response to whatever kind of manipulation is going on.
Sure. Well, I wanted to ask as well how religious trauma or religious trauma syndrome, as it gets more complicated, how it specifically impacts our gender and our sexuality. I know we talk about purity culture on this show a lot, but there's a lot here, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, my experience was growing up as a female in a fundamentalist environment. So my gender role was prescribed for me. I was to grow up, get married, and start having babies. So I didn't even, I dropped out of college when I met my husband. I was so relieved that someone wanted to marry me and that I could begin my real work of populating the kingdom,
Yeah, fill that quiver.
That's right. That's exactly right. And I was a fundy when we married, but I didn't get really hardcore fundy until we moved to a Bible college campus that happened to be quite conservative. And then while we were there, I started seeing these women in the grocery store in the town, and they always had their head coverings on, and they were very modestly dressed, always in long skirts and dresses. And then when I found out that was actually because the Bible says that, that's how women are to adorn themselves.
Naturally.
And then I thought, well, why aren't we being obedient? I want to be as obedient as I can be. And so that's when I started wearing my head covering. I took off my wedding ring, like I wasn't wearing any jewelry, anything like that, and really took a deep dive into that fundy hole. And that is especially where you see these massive differences between what is permissible for men and what's permissible for women. So that's kind of how I see the gender thing, at least the roles playing out there. And of course, as far as sexuality, I mean, just so much of the suppression and repression, like we talk about with purity culture. It's so damaging. I mean, a lot of people, when they are finally able to question religion, actually wonder if am I even straight? Maybe I'm not even really straight. Maybe I was just acting like a straight person because that's the way I was.
Yeah, been there.
Yeah.
Yes, I can relate as well because I'm bisexual, but I wasn't able to explore that obviously when I was married to my pastor husband, and so that was an important piece of my puzzle. Finally moving into a space where I could start to experiment and figure out what felt right for me and what felt good for me and have no shame about it.
That's what makes it so bad, is that it's a system that literally only works for straight white men, right? Like it's great if you're in that in group, but if you're anywhere on the LGBT spectrum or a woman, which is half of the population of humankind, right? Or somebody somewhere on that spectrum, as most of us are, right? There's no person that's absolutely perfectly straight or absolutely perfectly gay, right? Like everybody's on that spectrum somewhere. So this is really a system meant to only benefit the straightest of whitest of cisest of heterosist men. It's awful. Blows my mind.
You put it very well. That's exactly right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, the calls are starting to roll in. I want to give Nate a chance to jump onto the phones. But before we do, I wanted to just quickly ask, what kinds of treatments or techniques or strategies have you found helpful when we're talking not just about, trying to be happier, healthier, less anxious, less depressed kind of people, but are specifically dealing with this type of trauma?
Yeah. So of course, as you would know, part of it depends on the client and what their temperament is and what their background is. So I do not use EMDR in my practice, but a lot of people do find EMDR very helpful. I do a ton of grief work because many of my clients, maybe they haven't given themselves permission to actually acknowledge it. But if we can't mourn what we don't acknowledge. And so I will have them make a list of the costs that were associated with following religion and then with leaving religion. And it can be a pretty extensive list. And we go through those things and they have a chance to actually talk about them and mourn those losses. I find that actually is a really big deal and helpful deal. I do use CBT, of course. And then an amount of group work can be really therapeutic as well. So I see clients one-on-one, but I also run the Divorcing Religion workshop, which is group work. And I do it online. It takes 6 weeks. We meet every Sunday, and we go through the 6 modules of that workshop. And people come from all different backgrounds, but what they find is their grief and their sadness and their losses are quite similar. They can relate to each other, and more than that, they're able to support one another as they're moving into trying to build a healthy secular life for themselves.
Yeah, I lead a process group for religious trauma. And one of the things that we talked about early on was the fact that, you know, we're in a small group of people. There are 6 or 7 of us. We're all coming together. I gave everybody a chance to kind of share their deconversion story. And, you know, we acknowledged the fact that we were meeting on a Sunday night and, you know, really talked about how we were sort of like modeling or using some of those same religious tools that impacted us, because religion is a cultural thing. It is a group trauma. And so healing in a group setting makes a lot of sense and is a big part of the process. I also just want to very quickly mention, you brought up EMDR, which is a very specific therapy that I personally also don't use in my practice, but was very useful for me. And I might encourage people to investigate it. It's a very protocol-based, very specific type of therapy that you can just easily Google. It's a strategy for, I guess, in a lot of ways, like bypassing sort of your conscious mind is a way of getting closer to some of those like uncomfortable memories and some of those traumatic experiences without immediately triggering our body's like natural reactions to those memories. And something that I think a lot of people will find really helpful.
Yeah, look it up.
Yeah, for sure. I would encourage everybody who is curious, or really everybody who is listening to this. I'm imagining if you have found this channel, that some of this is either something that you have already gone through and are going through, or something that you're just now beginning to heal from. And I guess I just want to say over and over again that the mission of the ACA, the positive atheism that we espouse, it's not just about dunking on theists on AXP. It's not, you know, just about fighting the religion in the news and helping to like unplug people from religion. It's about reminding people that there are opportunities for healing from some of these things. And, you know, there are a lot of great therapists that are doing this kind of work and a lot of different ways and strategies for finding that healing.